Hello, this is World Business Report from the BBC World Service, where we bring you the latest in money, marketing, manufacturing, and yes, much, much more. Please review us, rate us, share us wherever you can. BBC podcasts are supported by advertising.
You decided to upgrade your outdoor deck, so you ordered the essentials, a power washer, a set of patio chairs, and a shiny new grill. And you used your Bank of America customized Cash Rewards credit card, choosing to earn 3% cash back on online shopping and up to 5.25% as a preferred rewards member, which you put towards your most essential deck addition, a bird feeder. Apply for yours at bankofamerica.com/more rewarding. Copyright 2021 Bank of America Corporation.
Hello and welcome to World Business Report. I'm Gareth Barlow. On the programme today, it's just hours until Canadians vote for a new government. We'll ask what businesses want from the election. E-commerce continues to boom in China, but does that fit with the government's plans? And as the Emmys roll round again,
Hollywood is really trying to strike that fine balance. How do we satisfy the top directors and filmmakers that want their films to debut exclusively in the theater, but also satisfy the consumers?
We'll be asking if they're doing just that. But first, since the beginning of the year, wholesale gas prices in the United Kingdom have risen 250%. And the trend isn't confined to just Britain. Across Europe and Asia, supplies are struggling to keep up with demand. Various factors are at play. A cold winter in Europe forced countries to eat into reserves. Meanwhile, calm weather now has led to falls in renewable energy and an increase in gas-powered electricity production. The result? Soaring prices. In the UK, the Business Secretary has met with energy firms and is pondering bailout loans to suppliers who face being forced out of business by the hike in the cost of wholesale gas. Well, let's get more details now with Ellen Fraser, energy expert with Baringa Partners.
Effectively, the gas prices are very closely linked to electricity. So if the availability of electricity in the UK is low, then we use gas to generate that electricity. Now, at the moment, the demand side in the UK is increasing, and actually the demand side globally and certainly in Northern Europe is increasing as we emerge from the pandemic and lots of businesses switch back on again. And similarly, as we enter winter, people are putting their heating back on again. So demand is increasing. From a supply standpoint then, we have had unusually calm weather in the UK, so wind generation has dropped off quite materially. Our gas storage in the UK is actually relatively low. And then typically, the grid has one or two outages, but we've seen a number of quite challenging outages on the grid as well.
The UK as an island, when it comes to these kind of issues, nowhere is independent, really. The Financial Times newspaper saying, brace for surge in Eurozone energy prices, economists warn. With more than one country at play here and with the issues kind of going across state boundaries, how much more complicated does that make to solve these energy problems and equally maybe reduce these prices?
Yeah, and in the short term, it's actually very difficult to solve them using your language. Really, we're in a situation where we have to manage them. We all need to hope that the weather actually gets slightly worse in some ways to get the wind generation back on grid and creating a little bit more energy on the supply side to ease some of those pressures. But you're absolutely right, that these are European-wide issues that are impacting multiple geographies. The interesting thing is that actually governments across Europe are starting to get more actively involved. So we've seen the Italian government step in with €1 billion euros of subsidy to protect customer bills. We've also seen the Spanish government make some interventions. And the theory would be that the Business Secretary meeting with industry players over the course of the weekend is likely to have been just starting to explore some of the opportunities and the need for the UK government actually to make some similar interventions in the UK market.
How will the events of the current moment impact how governments, not just in the UK but around the world, evaluate the tapestry of energy performance? And one means by that whether they focus on nuclear, on renewables, on old fossil fuels. What needs to be built into the system going forwards to ensure that there is sustainability and also level and predictable supply?
There's no doubt that there's much more tension in the system now. It used to be the case that you would generate electricity in a coal-fired power station. There would be one direction of supply that took that energy from the coal power station down the grid into a customer premise or into a manufacturing capability. The reality now is much, much different to that. So for a start, we have much more volatility, much more peakiness in the power that we get from renewable generation. So we've talked about calm weather, that drops off. Obviously, if we have extremely windy weather, the amount of energy is much higher. So, even just with that example, you can see big spikes within the generation, which obviously has to be balanced out somewhere because our consumption as customers doesn't necessarily match when the renewable generation is coming. In addition to that, the grid is becoming much, much more decentralised. So rather than having one or two big power stations in each location, you actually have micro-generation. You potentially also have customers exporting from their own properties onto the grid from, solar panels that might sit on their roofs, for example. So the whole grid system is becoming much, much more complex. So at the same time that we need to decentralise, we're managing that decentralisation, we're managing the volatility, we also have to decarbonise and move away from those coal-fired power stations for the benefit of the future climate. So, a huge amount of work by governments internationally and the UK being invested in making sure that we actually build a resilient system that can cope with flexible generation, with volatility within that generation, and also the various different dynamics of customers sometimes exporting, sometimes consuming, and all the changes that creates.
The voice of Ellen Fraser from Baringa Partners. So what does rising energy prices mean for inflation? A question I posed to the independent economist, Michael Hughes.
Well, for many central banks who are reporting on their monetary policy over the next week, they're not just going to take account of what has been or what's likely to happen to energy prices, but they're also going to be looking at what's been happening to wages. Because as their economies have recovered, there have been skill shortages and supply bottlenecks which are adding to inflationary pressures. So when we see these central banks respond this week, it wouldn't be a surprise if there's much more of a hawkish tone. And in the case of the Norwegian central bank, which isn't necessarily the biggest economy, but they're likely to be the first central bank within the developed world to actually be raising interest rates from something around 0 to 0.25. So we're on a hawkish trend, I suspect now.
There's lots of talk of inflation at the moment. How would you describe it?
Well, I would suggest that although people are prepared to accept that there are some elements of inflation which are transitory, purely because of what was happening a year ago, so the comparison is biased because of that.
That's the economies stopped and kind of ground to halt because of the pandemic and are now firing back up again.
Absolutely. But equally, given the supply difficulties which don't look as if they're going to go away quickly, and the fact that there do appear to be significant skill shortages right across Europe, then it's quite likely that I suspect the underlying inflation rate will actually prove to be a lot stickier than people were anticipating a little while ago.
You reference the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. Tell us more about what we should be looking out for from those guys.
Well, I suspect if they are going to be more hawkish, they will give notice of ending their quantitative easing program, their buying in of bonds, probably indicating that from December, possibly January of next year, then they will start to reduce the number of bonds that they will be buying in, and that reduction might last over 6 months or so. So by the time we get to the summer of next year, the anticipation will be that interest rates will be rising in the second half of that year. Now that's probably a year earlier than people had been anticipating a little while ago. And so it is part and parcel of a story that says the period where monetary policy has been hugely supportive worldwide is coming to an end.
Can businesses and can banks stand that support dropping away, do you think?
I think they can if interest rate rises are kept within a reasonably low level. I think the bigger difficulty will be in terms of governments who have borrowed huge amounts of money and where the debt servicing costs have been to date relatively low. Well, if you start seeing interest rates rise even by relatively modest amounts, like 50 basis points or so, then you'll see those debt servicing costs increasing quite dramatically. And that is going to prove very difficult for governments who are trying to reduce their budget deficit over time.
Michael Hughes. Canadians head to the polls on Monday for a federal election after the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called a snap election in August. He'd hoped to capitalise on favourable ratings to form a majority government. Topping the agenda has been the pandemic and Canada's economic recovery. Mark Agnew is Senior Vice President for Policy and Government Relations at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He says for his members, dealing with the pandemic must be a top priority for the next government.
There's sort of two different aspects to that. One is for companies that are in the hospitality, tourism, and transportation sectors, they're still not able to operate at full capacity because of the health restriction. There's a number of support programs that are in place. Those expire at the end of November, and we want to see new legislation introduced fairly quickly that'll extend those. The other piece of it, too, is that, we're in a very fortunate spot here in Canada where vaccination rates are, quite high. And certainly the conversation has advanced a lot here around digital vaccine credentials and, vaccine mandates from employers to their employees. But companies are really wanting a lot of legal certainty as to what can they do, what can't they do. And that type of guidance, I think, is really critical.
With regards to COVID, the natural reaction for almost every government in the world when the pandemic kicked off was to spend a lot of money to secure PPE, to try and secure vaccines. And as the months have worn on and as economies have started to pick back up again, governments have been thinking how to recoup those costs. And the natural way for so many is to increase taxes. What's the conversation in Canada, and can businesses stand to potentially have to pay more in due course?
So what we've seen certainly here in Canada is, widespread support, at least in the early days of the pandemic, to increase that, government spending. But that being said, the public credit card is pretty close to getting maxed out. And there have been a number of proposals that we've seen put forward in the election that would propose to raise taxes on, some businesses. According to one party's platform, we're seeing more broad-based business tax increases in other parties' platforms. So we'll see what happens based on, who wins Monday night. But generally speaking, there is certainly concern from our members that there's going to be an increase in taxation to help, balance the books. And depending on who you talk to, I think there's varying levels of concern as to what that could mean for their company.
Stepping aside from the pandemic, there's plenty of other issues at play, whether that's the trading relationship with the United States, whether that's the balance between traditional sectors for you guys, whether that's energy production, whether that's mining, whether that's oil production in the tar sands regions. And then also looking after the climate as well. What are the big concerns are you facing going forwards?
Absolutely. When it comes to what we're hearing from members, besides the pandemic, trade relationship with the United States is number one. There's currently the Buy America provisions that are in the infrastructure package that's before Congress. We'd love to see a Canada exemption, for those as part of the final deal that is passed. In our economy, the natural resources sector is absolutely critical, especially out in Western Canada, and also more broadly in the economy. You talk about the supply chain, benefits from supporting the oil and gas sector, and the industry and the Canadian business community is fully bought into net zero. However, because of the nature of our economy, the pathway for us to get there is going to look a lot different than perhaps it would be for other countries such as the United Kingdom. And so, one of the things that we want to see is more government support to enable companies to tap into, private sector financing to get us to that transition to net zero, because it's going to require a lot of capital investment in new technologies. One of the other things as well that we're quite keen to see work on is actually around critical minerals. We have a lot of stuff in the ground here in Canada. We haven't done a great job of getting it out, and Canada can play a major role for, Western industrialized countries in supplying those minerals that you use, everything from cell phones to solar panels to even defense and security applications. And that's something that is a lot of untapped potential for the Canadian economy.
You've talked a lot about what we would like to see, or our members. How confident do you feel that the future governments will look favourably upon business and upon the economy?
It's always mixed views with these things. We never hear about business issues as much as a business organization wants to see in the campaign. And particularly if the polls are correct in suggesting that we're heading into what we call a minority parliament, what a lot of your listeners in the UK would otherwise call a hung parliament, there's going to have to be some deal making that happens between the various parties. And certainly we don't want to see business interests be a casualty, in that. And of course, depending on what type of sector you're in, it's no different here in Canada than it is in other countries around the world, where certain sectors are sort of easy scapegoats and become sort of a political whipping boy, if you will. And of course, we don't want to see that happen.
Mark Agnew from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. In recent months, we've reported on the Chinese authorities' efforts to increase control over tech firms and e-commerce. The sector is steadily growing in China and is estimated to be worth $3.3 trillion by 2025, according to forecasts from Global Data, an analytics and consulting company based in London. But what impact might the tussle between tech companies and the government have on the growth of e-commerce and of those forecasts? Sam Murrant is lead analyst at Global Data.
E-commerce is a big engine for electronic payments growth worldwide in general, particularly due to lockdowns and pandemic last year and continuing on into this year, restricting how consumers move around and some of the habits that have been picked up around online shopping for things that had previously been bought physically are being retained.
$3 trillion is an impressive amount. How does China compare to other markets?
It's the biggest at this point. The second largest is the US. It was passed a fair amount ago, which is not particularly surprising given the population disparity between the two markets. And China's obviously been ramping up its economic development. E-commerce and alternative payments in general are very, very popular there.
Alternative payments are popular, e-commerce increasingly popular, but Beijing is taking an increasingly different view, increasing its regulation, its crackdown, its control over the internet. How does that play out between Beijing's wants and the wants of its population?
Certainly the last couple of years we've seen a lot more pressure from the Chinese government on the population in general and the internet access and usage, but also its own major financial technology companies with respect to players like Alipay and WeChat. So those two players have an enormous share of the Chinese market, more than half of all e-commerce transactions, as well as quite a lot of the in-store presence as well. A lot of the mobile payments over there are done through one of these two apps, and the regulators are now going after those and at the same time introducing its own more centralized financial system. The digital yuan project, the development of that's being ramped up a bit. The digitization of the yuan itself being turned into a digital token and traded. The way I read it, as part of an attempt to sort of push this as a payment method, the Chinese government is sort of stepping in to restrict the power of the private companies. It's not the only reason that they're doing it, but it's the one that seems most obvious to me from sort of where I sit and what I look at.
The growth rate of the e-commerce sector in China has been pretty steady. It's a pretty steady upward trend, and you're forecasting big numbers for the next couple of years. Does this, and you use the phrase rein in some of these online companies, does this reining in, as many people see it, by the government threaten that trend, though?
I don't necessarily see it threatening the everyday usage of the wallets, the WeChat Pay and Alipay. These companies are a lot bigger than just those payment systems. The parent company of Alipay, Ant Financial, is effectively but not quite a bank and offers a wide range of services besides. WeChat obviously is owned by Tencent, which has its fingers in innumerable pies in the internet sector in general, to say nothing of financial services. The regulatory attention that's being levied at these players is breaking up their dominance of kind of everyday life and transactions. I do see, perhaps into the longer term, more competition perhaps being introduced into the market. There's a lot of inertia behind these players, though. And the question does sort of arise of, as more players come into the market, do merchants start accepting them without the consumer base? I mean, that sort of thing can be imposed from the top down in a market like China, potentially, but not without action on the level we haven't really seen, such as, for example, shutting down the operations of Alipay or WeChat, which it doesn't seem to be on the cards at the moment.
Sam Murrant from Global Data. The 73rd Primetime Emmy Awards are underway right now as we speak. Well, not quite right now. They're actually on an ad break at the moment, but they are taking place. And last year, the awards had their lowest ever ratings. But it's hoped pandemic box set binging, teamed up with the comedy veteran Cedric the Entertainer as host, will see viewers tune in to see who's won what.
Your Majesty, I think we have enough respect for one another personally to ask ourselves some of the bigger questions, woman to woman.
Miss Daphne Bridgerton.
You have no idea what it is to have one's entire life reduced to a single moment.
This is a bit of news from the other side of the Atlantic. AFC Richmond announced the hiring of their new manager, American football coach Ted Lasso.
can't remember anything about it. Yes, I'm your best friend, so I have to ask. Why'd you clean it up? I don't know.
Just some of the titles vying for a trophy there. The Crown, Bridgerton, Ted Lasso and The Flight Attendant. Well, for more on tonight's awards, shortly before we came on air, I spoke with KJ Matthews, a Hollywood entertainment reporter based in LA.
We are still living in the pandemic. You remember last year it was all virtual, unfortunately at a record low in terms of ratings. Not a lot has changed other than we're having more of kind of like a hybrid show. It's a big tent outdoors. They're inviting probably just a couple of hundred people, certainly not as many as they would before the pandemic, but the show must go on.
Why is that so important? Why do these award shows worry so much about the viewers of them?
They make a lot of money from advertising, obviously, with various commercials. And so when you have something like, the Primetime Awards, having their lowest viewership last year, I think it was only like 5.1 million total viewers, and that's down 14%. And I think a lot of it is just the competition. There are so many things to watch on television, on cable, on network, on streaming, that these award shows are just fighting for eyeballs.
You mentioned that keyword there, streaming. We talk about the rise of streaming services, which seems a little bit outdated now because they've risen. They're here. They're not going away, certainly not in the short term. Where does that balance of power lie now with regards to old school terrestrial TV and the streamers? Who are we going to see being the big winners when it comes to the production companies and also the channels that air it?
When streaming first popped up, there was Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon. Now we've got Apple TV Plus. We have Disney Plus. We have HBO Max. There's even more than that are popping up, it seems like, every single year. At the Emmy Awards this year, Apple is really in the forefront. They've got a show called Ted Lasso that's got 20 nominations, and that's just miraculous. I mean, doing very, very, very well. That's a really, really good comedy about an American guy who's hired to coach a British football team. And then Disney Plus is doing extremely well. With their Star Wars series, The Mandalorian has 24 nominations. Disney Plus and Apple TV Plus doing extremely well this year. When it comes to streaming and getting nominations. Of course, you always still got Netflix and Hulu and Amazon, but it just goes to show you that the big ones like Netflix, Amazon, and Hulu, they're having to fight. They're not just dominating with no competition.
And you mentioned there, you allude to it, you say the words Disney, Mandalorian, Star Wars, this morphing between the big screen and the small screen. The Emmys is all about the small screen, obviously, but the fact that TV now is such big budget, high profile, massive names, millions, if not billions of dollars being paid to produce this stuff. Do we see that trend continuing, do you think?
Absolutely, because as long as these production companies and these streaming networks can lure people like Jennifer Aniston and Reese Witherspoon, like they deal with The Morning Show on Apple TV Plus, they will continue to bring them to the small screen and on the streaming networks. There's no reason to slow this down. Hollywood is really trying to strike that fine balance. How do we satisfy the top directors and filmmakers and the actresses that want their films to debut exclusively in the theater, but also satisfy the consumers like us that want to sit in the comfort of our living room in our pajamas with popcorn and just watch major movies from there and not even have to leave the house, particularly during this pandemic.
KJ Matthews on the 73rd Primetime Emmys. And if you want to know who's won, head to our website, bbc.com/news. Thanks for listening.